The following is made possible by the Arpin Group and by Renewable Now. The International Society of Sustainability Professionals presents ISSP Conference 2014, the conference that's making sustainability standard practice. Featuring the Sustainability Hall of Fame Wisdom Panel, keynote speaker Joel Makower of GreenBiz.com, the 2014 Sustainability Hall of Fame induction, up-close partner profiles, and insight on the future of sustainability.
Hi, I'm Jeff Bjorzik. I'm one of the board members for ISSP. Just very briefly, I'm up here to introduce Joel Makower. I just want to say, one of the things that's so great about these conferences is just the diversity of people who come, the difference of education, backgrounds, geography, and that's really what makes us such a strong organization. When I was getting my MBA way back in 2000, one of the very most important information sources that I used to turn to was this site called greenbiz.com, and that's where I learned probably half of what I was talking about at the time, and really helped me leverage myself into my career into sustainability. So with that, I'd like to welcome Joel Makower. I don't think he really needs a whole lot of introduction. I hope that everybody knows who he is and what GreenBiz is and how valuable that site is for us. So please join me in welcoming Joel Makower.
Thanks, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. Morning. Come on, you can do better than that. Yeah. Thank you, Maureen and Dorothy and Marcia and everyone who invited me here and to this great event, this great organization. But thank you, all of you, for what you do. I bet you don't hear that often enough. You probably, to Maureen's earlier point, you probably have to explain what you do a lot, and even then, most people don't get it. I know I do. After 25 or so years, and people say, well, what do you do? Well, I have a media and events company focusing at the intersection of business, sustainability, and technology. And there's sort of a moment of silence, and they say, good for you. And that's kind of the short conversation. So I know, I feel your pain in that, but I also really appreciate all that you do and how hard you work, sometimes struggling upstream within your own organizations, sometimes just trying to explain it to your family, and so no one is more appreciative and grateful for all of that than I. What I want to do this morning is talk a little bit about sort of what's going on out there. I always like to start with sort of a level setting kind of thing, which is to imagine you were to go to whatever news source you go to for business news, and you were to see some of these kinds of headlines here, that the largest, most iconic apparel brands in the world announced that they were pledged to be part of a group of companies that would seek no deforestation in any of their supply chains for what they source, or that a major grocery chain, supermarket chain, had developed a rating system for produce that they were going to have in their stores for health and environmental criteria, or that one of the largest consumer products goods company pledged that it was going to make commitments around improving its water efficiency, particularly in the water-stressed areas of the world in which it operated, and of course that's very many of them. One of the largest automotive companies in the world had announced that they had just certified their 122nd plant out of about 150 or so as landfill-free, nothing going to landfill. Or that another one, major consumer products packaged goods company, announced that they were going to disclose all of their ingredients for fragrances, something that had been asked of them for years and years, not just by activists, but by parents, by customers, by people who wanted to know what they were putting in or on their body. And that one of the largest retailers in the world had announced that they were achieving food system transparency and traceability, but by developing some new systems. And as you can see, all that happened last month. And all that happens every month. And I think you all know that, at least intuitively, that this is an ongoing drumbeat of activity, and that this is not, sort of a green marketing kind of thing. In fact, most of what's going on out there is not being talked about, either certainly in the mainstream media and in many ways just even by the companies themselves, because they're actually contrary to what most people think about business. These companies are walking more than they're talking. They're doing more than they're really saying. There's reasons for that, and I'm not going to get into that right now. Maybe that's maybe a conversation for later today. But I think that's a real interesting challenge. But what I want to do this morning is to talk sort of where we're coming from and where we're going, but I want to do it in a way that something I've never done before. I was telling Bob Willard that I was. I have a friend, John Willard, and I just conflated your names. Bob Willard, that this is something a little apprehensive. I've never really told my story as sort of a vehicle for sort of where I see this field has come. And so sort of want to talk about sort of where I came from and how I got to this and where we are now, and then why I'm still, after all these years, still very excited about what's going on out there. Why I have continue to have great hope for this field and for the world as a result of what is possible in the world of business. So I come to this, started my career as a journalist. That's not the start of my career. That's probably 7 or 8 years into it, and I know that only by virtue of that 2 floppy drive PC that's in the background there. So I was probably already 29, 30 by the time this picture was taken. But I studied journalism because I didn't have a clue really what I wanted to be if I grew up. And my hypothesis was that under the guise of sticking my nose into other people's business and writing about it, I'd find something that I was good at and interested in and synced with my interests and values and lifestyle and whatever was important to me back then in my early 20s. And for the sort of the cosmic joke for me, at least for the first 15 years, it turns out what I was good at and interested in and synced with all those things was sticking my nose in other people's business and writing about it. But there were two things that were going on when I was in journalism school in the mid-'70s. One was Watergate. That was about journalists as truth tellers. And the other was Ralph Nader, the good consumer advocate Nader, not the election-busting Nader. Who was taking on General Motors and big corporations and advocating for a lot of things that had been going on for a long time in the world of business, between business and consumers, and all of a sudden advocating for consumers, and started really the whole consumer protection movement. And those things were meaningful to me, and those things inspired me, and that was part of what I saw aligning, beginning with my journalism career. And as it progressed, what I found was interesting to me was the intersection of 3 things. One was business, one was technology, and one was society, is how those came together. So just for example, the first book I wrote in 1981 was about the health effects of office environments. Really kind of early days for this stuff, but what was going on in 1981 was that they were sealing up all the buildings to save energy after the energy crisis in the 70s. They were tearing out all the interior walls to make the open, Dilbert culture, open office cubicle thing, bringing in all these synthetics, carpeting and particle board for desks and other kinds of coverings and materials that hadn't been in the office before, running the air conditioning less, again, to save money and energy, and then bringing in automation. Computers, fax machines, and all that. And this book actually predated PCs. They were just, at the time, workstations for larger computer systems. And what we're finding at the time was that there was a lot less flexibility if you were an office worker, that you couldn't open and close the door or the windows or turn on and off the lights, or the temperature was controlled by a computer in the basement. And even some of the work was starting to become routinized, where something would come up and the worker would do 2 or 3 things, and it would go away, and something else would come up and they'd do 2 or 3 things and would go away, and sort of like a factory. And that was starting to cause problems. Oh, and by the way, ergonomics was not yet out there, and so they were plopping this technology on this old furniture, and people were adjusting their bodies to the technology rather than the other way around. And so all of a sudden, what had been sort of the cushy office job had become problematic. So that was interesting to me, and that sort of put me in a space to think about things that I didn't realize at the time was about green building and energy efficiency and worker health and safety and a number of things that were just parts of this story that became interesting. And fast forwarding to 1989, I was asked to create the US edition of a British bestseller called The Green Consumer Guide. And I looked at this book. This was about, the book had been a #1 best-selling paperback in the UK, written by John Elkington and Julia Hales. And I looked at this book. Penguin Book had bought the US rights from the British publisher, and I had a relationship with Penguin, and they said, would you Americanize this? That was the term they used, and I thought, oh, that's easy. You turn S's into Z's and plop out the letter U here and there. And it turned out to be much more complicated than that, and I thought that it really wasn't even an appropriate book for American audiences, and I turned it down, and I said, this wouldn't work, and you'd almost have to write a new book. And they said, well, great, write a new book. And at the time, I was starting to get wind of Earth Day 1990, which was, as you recall, and around then, a big media deal. It was sort of the renaissance of Earth Day, modern environmental movement. And so I went forward with this, and it came out earlier that year in 1990 in the run-up to the big Earth Day media hype, and I was instantly ordained an expert on green consumer issues, and I very quickly had a weekly syndicated column in about 90 papers called The Green Consumer, with the Boulder Camera being one of them. And I very quickly realized two things. There was no green consumer movement in the US. There may, in fact, have been a reason why my book was called The Green Consumer. And by the way, it wasn't me, right? But number two was that the companies I was being asked to come in and talk to about this stuff were themselves grappling with a whole range of issues around waste and energy and toxics and other things. And that was interesting to me. And so in 1991, I launched a monthly newsletter called the Green Business Letter, 8-page printed newsletter. We stuck it in something called the mail that we sent out to people. People delivered. And that was really interesting. And published that for, well, about 15 years until I finally folded it into what I started doing. And it was really interesting to think about this stuff. I don't know if you can, how much you can see from back there, but I was looking as I was scanning some of these back issues to create this slide. I was looking at this and I was saying, so this one that's up front there now that is about how biodiversity is emerging as a bottom line issue. That was, I think it says September 1997. And yeah, that's still a story that we would probably run today on GreenBiz and probably have. Excuse me. So a lot of these issues were bubbling around back then, which is what, 17, 18 years ago, and before then. And so it's been really interesting to watch all of that. But about that time, the late 90s, and I'm old enough to say this sentence, as are many of you, and then the web came along, right? I saw an opportunity to sort of capture some of this for some things that weren't getting out there broadly enough or weren't being really captured in any way. And I had this idea for this resource center on business and the environment, and this is 1998, 99. There was, at the time, no business model for giving away information on the internet. I was still living in Washington, D.C. at the time. I hadn't returned back to my native Oakland, California. If I had been in California back in 1998, 99, the lack of a business model would not have been an impairment or a gating issue, and I probably would have raised a lot of money, lost it, and I'd be selling insurance or something by now. But fortunately, there wasn't that. And I created this nonprofit, and in June 2000, about the time that Jeff was in business school, I started this website, that's what it looked like back then when Jeff was in his MBA program. And over that time, now almost 15 years, it's morphed into a number of different iterations. As the company, I mean, we're not just a website anymore. In fact, the web piece of it, from a business perspective, this is the version we just launched a couple of weeks ago, the latest iteration. the media part of it from a revenue business perspective is actually a teeny part of what we actually do. We do events. We have a membership group of sustainability executives from big companies that we bring together several times a year, face-to-face, for peer-to-peer learning and group therapy. But it's been a really fascinating ride in all of this, and to be able, month after month, week after week, and really day after day, to track, chronicle, and in some ways anticipate where this world in which we all operate professionally is going and where it's been. It's been a really fun and exciting and stimulating journey to just keep track of all this. And we don't really cover news that much because there really isn't a lot of news in the field these days. We used to, sort of do these stories, and it's amazing how many companies still think that, that publishing a sustainability report is worthy of news. That's there's 600 published a year at least in the U.S., and it's hardly a story, but once or twice a year something is actually said in those that's interesting. But a few years ago, and then we have this great company now, a team of about 15 or 16 people that produce all these great things that I'm blessed to be a part of and learn from every day. About 7 or I guess 8 years ago, we decided to step back and take the pulse of all this. What's going on for all this stuff that we talk about, that we put up on the website, that we have at our conferences? Is it moving the needle? Is it making a difference? Because that's kind of important to know. And generally, we don't often do that. I mean, one of the challenges of this field is that there are no standards for what it means to be a sustainable business. And so, given the lack of standards, almost any company can set a target, achieve it, and declare victory, and they do. And so we don't really know where we're going. So we partnered with a company called TrueCost. They are based in the UK, have a significant, growing U.S. presence. They do something really interesting. Was that they measure the 700 different environmental impacts for about 4,500 publicly traded companies. Let me say that again, 700 different environmental impacts for 4,500 companies. And what they do for each of those things is they're taking publicly reported data, and where that doesn't exist, they actually do some extrapolation based on a variety of measures and algorithms and things that they do. And they put a dollar or euro or yen value on all of these things. So you can actually look at the financial impact, the natural capital costs, as they call it, the actual financial equivalent of what the cost is to the earth of taking out the resources to do commerce and then putting waste and emissions into the biosphere. And so we started using some of their data, and they do it on a company-by-company basis or sector-by-sector, so that companies can learn about themselves and benchmark. But we started looking at it on an aggregate basis, both for the S&P 500 companies and for a larger measure of a couple thousand global companies, companies based outside the U.S. It's both U.S. and non-U.S. companies under what's called the MSCI index. And so we came up with a bunch of metrics, and they're kind of underwhelming. So this is the total greenhouse gas emissions, not the intensity, but the actual absolute amounts. What we do, two ways to measure impacts. One is the actual absolute, and the other is to do it by normalized to revenue or widgets or something like that, which is the way that businesses do. But the planet doesn't care about normalization; it cares about absolute, how much actual carbon is going into the planet. And so, as you can see, this is greenhouse gases, and the gray line, as you'll see across all of these, is the global. The global values, and the blue is for the S&P 500, the U.S. companies. And you see, it's kind of hasn't changed much. It grew, in fact, a bunch when the recession started recovering, and it's kind of leveled off and not declined much. Waste in metric tons, same thing. It continues to grow again as economic activity continues to grow. Water use. Same thing. It continues to. And by the way, this report is free. You can download it from GreenBiz. So you can grab it at any time. There's actually a very cool iPad edition that you can get that's got a little bit more interactivity. Again, all free. Even the amount that companies are disclosing about their environmental impacts and costs is leveled off, or in the case of the U.S. companies, declined. So it's kind of sobering. It's kind of sobering to look at all this kind of cool stuff that's going on out there, the stuff I was showing at the beginning that happens every week, every month, every year, and to say, it's not necessarily helping. And so the bottom line is that most of the trends are leveling off or headed in the wrong direction, which means that as much as companies are doing, it's not enough. Simply, it's not moving the needle. And that's a problem. Here's what I think is the most interesting one of all, that if you take all those natural capital costs, and it's complex how you translate, pulling water out of a stream and what the dollar value of that water is. And True Cost has methodologies. They publish it. You can read all about it, let alone all these other metrics that they do. But when you take all those costs and you look at them as a percentage of net income, also known as profit, that basically, if companies had to pay the full cost of their impacts, it would wipe out their profits. In some cases, more than wipe out their profits. And so that right now, companies aren't asked to pay the full cost of water or carbon emissions or even energy. But that's, I think, a sobering reality, the fact that we don't really have this tiger by the tail yet. We still are grappling with all of this. Here's one last piece of data from this, which is looking at all these impacts from a dollar value by sector, from the biggest sector, utilities, to the smallest one, real estate, in this, and what the actual, in billions of dollars, the annual environmental costs are, at least as the way they're measured by True Cost. And what's interesting about this is that 4 of these sectors represent 2/3 of all the impacts: utilities, food and ag, oil and gas, and basic resources, which is essentially forestry and mining. And as you know, these, and again, I see people writing this down. This is all in the report, so you can grab all of this if you want, but feel free to take notes. These four sectors are all upstream. This is the beginning of the supply chain for just about every product and service, or at least a lot of them. And so we often spend a lot of our time downstream at the product level, or the company level in the service sector, and there's a lot of great companies doing a lot of great things, including this hotel and Starwood, a company that owns it, is, I think, one of the leaders in this space. But hospitality is down there somewhere, or in this, and maybe under travel and leisure. It's not the big impacts. And so I'm not saying we shouldn't be looking at that and dealing with it, but the real impacts are way upstream. And so I think we need to keep that in mind as we look forward to as we look at what we do and we assess, what companies need to be doing and how they need to be thinking about this. So it's a little depressing. It's a little bit of a downer to look at this stuff and to say, feel good about all that we do, and then to really, look at all this. But I want to talk about 3 reasons that I'm still excited about this, and that I'm very hopeful, and that I still believe that the work that you all are doing is critically important and will become more so in the coming years. One is this field I just talked about. I still believe that this is really important stuff, and here's why: because there's so many components of this that as I sat down to create this slide, because I hadn't really articulated this at least on stage before, is that I came up with this list in about 10 minutes of just without really breaking a sweat. And I probably could have added a lot more, but the depth and breadth of this field is really quite amazing in terms of where it's going and how far into companies it's reaching. It's a problem if you're a chief sustainability officer in a big company now, because this is becoming so dispersed within the company fabric that in some cases the companies are actually abolishing that role. I'm not sure that's a good thing for the company, certainly not a good thing for the chief sustainability officer, but they're sending the message that this needs to be embedded within the company, and this is everybody's responsibility. I still think somebody needs to be in charge, someone needs to be looking at this and accountable, and then feeding back to everybody how it's going. But just the breadth of this in looking at sustainable ag, which is becoming, coming out of the margins and into the mainstream. Sustainable beef is really, I think, fascinating. It was one of the most complex supply chains in the world, and now McDonald's is on a path, along with a lot of other companies around the world, to create what they call sustainable beef. And what that means and how that happens is just a terrifically exciting exercise with it that I think will have a really positive outcome. And so this continues to be an incredibly dynamic and vibrant field that has, I believe, really no boundaries in the world of business. And by the way, this is largely, the world I look at is largely big business. There's the whole world of small and mid-sized enterprises that's a green field, really. It's largely untapped, and they need a lot of help. And it's harder to do that from a consulting perspective because they don't necessarily have resources, financial resources to do that, or personal resources internally. But there's huge opportunities all through this. So this continues to be, for me, an area that I have not even begun to get bored with after 25 years. I still find it incredibly stimulating and exciting. The second thing is the mashup of technology and sustainability. So in addition to co-founding GreenBiz Group, I co-founded another company called Clean Edge back in 2000, 2001, a clean technology research company that still exists. I'm less involved with it these days. But I spent, as a result of that, was sort of there at the beginning of the clean tech revolution, as some people call it. Actually, my co-founder wrote a book by that title. So, watched that field develop, and if you know the Gartner hype cycle, sort of go through this peak of inflated expectations, and now this trough of disillusionment, and now it's coming out of that to actually be part of the fabric of what we do. In fact, clean technology, we don't even talk about it anymore. It's just in the same way we don't talk about e-commerce. It's just commerce. Clean technology these days is just kind of technology. But early on, there was these two worlds that I had one foot in each. That one was about how sustainable business and how companies were integrating sustainability into their operations and in a way that aligned with core business strategy and values and business propositions. And the other was clean technology, which is new technologies and companies and markets for energy, water, materials, transportation, and other things, food and ag products. And for a long time, I described them as two circles that were trying to become a Venn diagram. And somewhere about almost 10 years ago, in the late 2000, in the aughts, or whatever we still call that decade, it started to overlap, and as we saw GE, Eco Imagination, a number of other things come into the field, and as solar and green buildings and other things became mainstream. And that intersection of sustainability and technology is really fascinating. So we launched a conference around this about four years ago, of looking at this convergence, specifically of energy technologies, information and communications technologies, building technologies, and transportation technologies, and what happens when they converge. What happens when they mash up, and what the opportunities are for business, for society, for the environment. And of course, within each of these boxes, there's hundreds, in some cases thousands, of sub-technologies. There's just a smattering of them here that become part of this. But this is really an incredibly dynamic area that has huge implications in terms of accelerating sustainability solutions in a climate-constrained world. So we launched this conference. We've done it in Boston, London, Paris, Sao Paulo, Shanghai. We just had our most recent event 2 weeks ago in San Francisco. We had about 1,300 people, and a really, really interesting conversation about the role of technology. And it's a very different conversation than is taking place at this conference or most other traditional sustainability conferences, because it's really about the opportunity space. It's around a whole range. Well, that's the conference last week, 2 weeks ago. And it's about a whole bunch of technology trends that are already taking place. It's around how data infuses everything in the cloud, and machine-to-machine communications, which is every time your email pops up automatically on your phone. And I see some of you checking it right now to make sure. That's machine-to-machine communication. Then it's part of so many things that we do that we don't even know that it exists. All the telecoms and many tech companies have huge new business operations around this, and the Internet of Things and the sharing economy and the smart grid and the next generation of smart cities and connected vehicles and all of that. So these aren't individually new, but what we started to really look at Verge is what happens when they come together. What's the opportunity space that when they converge? And it's really extraordinarily fascinating, both from a technology perspective, but also from a sustainability perspective, in terms of how these things accelerate dematerialization and energy efficiency and carbon reductions and all sorts of things. We actually created sort of a new ecosystem. We like to talk about Verge. This is not your mother's sustainability conference, of bringing together 3 or even more audiences that hadn't really been together, which was the big corporates, our traditional audience at GreenBiz, the disruptive startups, the Next Nests and other companies like that are creating innovative products or whole platforms around building cities, vehicles, information, energy, and cities, which really hadn't been a part of this conversation. And it's kind of a new conversation that's taken several years worth of Verge conferences before people started learning a new language and they started talking in full sentences, and now they're actually not only talking in paragraphs but actually having real conversations. It's been really exciting to watch this develop and to see the synergies start to create. One example of that is something that Jerry attended 2 weeks ago on behalf of the city of Denver, which was something that emerged out of this, and I think it sort of talks to sort of what the opportunity is here. We got approached. We have 6 tracks in Verge around energy, some of the things you saw: energy, vehicles, transportation and mobility, building systems, smart supply chains, food and water technology systems, and cities. And it was a little bit, the cities part was new for us. We hadn't really spent a lot of time with that. And in sort of a Kevin Costner, if you build it kind of way, we found that we started getting approached by, 2 organizations. One is called C40, which was a mashup actually itself of the Clinton Climate Initiative and Bloomberg around, started with the 40 of the biggest cities in the world that had significant carbon reduction goals, and now it's almost 80 cities, about 20 of which have really bold, audacious carbon reduction goals of 80, called 80 by 50, 80% carbon reductions by mid-century. And they don't really know how they're going to get there, how they're going to get past maybe 30 by 30. And then there's another group called the USDN. Are you remember? The Urban Sustainability Directors Network, 120 Jerry's, 120 North American city sustainability directors. And C40 and USDN came to us and asked, could you help us have a more effective conversation with the private sector about the technologies that we cities need to meet our smart city and carbon reduction goals? Because they don't really understand what we need, and we don't really understand what they have. Their technology cycles are out of sync with our procurement cycles. They're selling widgets and we're buying solutions, or vice versa. And so we held a one-day hands-on workshop, no talking heads, really sitting at tables and working out about 35 North American cities, about 35 mostly big companies, and about 35 thought leaders to really hash this out. We didn't solve the problem, but we I think, began a conversation that is going to continue, not just at our events, but I think is going to continue outside of that. And it speaks to the new spirit of collaboration and the new non-traditional kinds of collaborations that need to happen, which is not so easy. it's not easy. We talk about collaboration and partnerships like, yeah, of course, but doing that stuff is just extremely difficult. And so that was certainly the case, and is certainly the case with cities and technology companies. And so we see a really exciting role in all of that. So Verge is really exciting, and it really, in some ways, is what sustainable business should be about. Systems thinking and deep reductions, radical efficiencies, innovation, collaboration and partnerships, and actually, at the end of the day, improving lives and moving the needle. And as you probably know, and may not always like to admit, so much of what is committed under the name of sustainable business is incremental eco-efficiency improvements that are, yeah, necessary, but highly insufficient. And so, you know, adding this technology piece has really, I think, accelerated the opportunities to get where we're all trying to get with our companies and clients, which is the kinds of really radical efficiencies and improvements, and the cool innovations that come out of that need to happen. The third piece is really, it's happening in real time for me, and it's really exciting and interesting, which is how security in all of its many forms wraps into all of this. And it begins with a little bit of a story, starting here at this five-sided building. I can't remember what it's called. In 2009, a Marine colonel by the name of Mark Puck Mickleby. His nickname is not because he was Shakespearean in any way, but because he was from Minnesota and played hockey. And a Navy captain named Wayne Porter were brought to the Pentagon. Wayne already worked directly for Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and Puck was brought there to work with Wayne. And they were tasked to come up with a grand strategy for America. Not a military strategy, a grand strategy for America. So it turns out, I didn't know this, most people don't, that a grand strategy is a thing that we have done in America at critical times in our history. During World War II, the grand strategy is the way of aligning our economic engine, our foreign policy engine, our military might, and even, to some extent, our cultural engine. So during World War II, we were the arsenal for democracy. That was the grand strategy, and we obviously aligned our military and with the economy. We turned our auto factories into tank factories, and really the economy shifted in a whole direction to support the war effort. After the war, we knew that we could not beat the Russians on the battlefield. So the strategy was containment. How, using our economic, foreign policy, and military engines, could we contain communism? And so it was everything from math and science and schools and the space program to Vietnam. And, you know, we did. In 1991, that kind of happened. But we haven't had a strategy since then. And we've kind of been, you know, addressing 21st century challenges with 20th century tools. And that was the exercise. And so these guys came up with a report that, and I'll tell you why in a second, but was not published by the Pentagon because it turned out to be much more about domestic policy than foreign. It was published, and it's a free download somewhere by the Wilson Center in, I think, 2011. But it embedded sustainability in the center. It called for sustainability as our new strategic national imperative. How do we achieve our enduring national interests of prosperity and security by embedding sustainability in all of its many forms, environmental, social, economic, into the fabric? Is fascinating exercise. The Pentagon, as I said, didn't know what to do with it, and Puck, as a result, ended up retiring after 20-some years in the Marines, and Wayne Porter is still in the Navy. But Puck went off and started with a foreign policy grand strategy expert named Patrick Doherty, and they started just recently, in the last few months, a a strategic innovation lab, a model after the National Real Energy Labs at Case Western University in Cleveland. And so there were three pillars of what they're talking about: walkable communities, regenerative agriculture, and resource productivity. And what's fascinating about these is when you drill down into this and you get to see how it's very complicated, and I'm not going to do justice to it right now. That will come in a few months and the next year and years. But of how addressing these things, both individually and collectively, start to address a whole range of things that I think are all, anybody would agree are things that would be goals for any nation, certainly America, about reviving our economy, aligning our U.S. interests with those of our trading partners and other partners around the world, how to sort of win back the hearts and minds, create a better story about America, restore our credibility, how to engage citizens and restore trust in government, how to send the kind of price signals we need that bring sustainability or push markets more towards sustainability, how to avoid resource wars or mitigate some of that and slow ecological depletion, and how to really, I think this word that we're hearing more and more about, how to embed resilience into our world. Resilience being the ability to withstand shocks of any kind, whether they're economic, disease, terrorism, or extreme weather and climate shocks. Resilience is now, I think, a growing term, often conflated or used along with sustainability. So this, to me, was just fascinating. And what I loved about this, and particularly about Puck and Patrick, but Puck in particular, who's spoken at our events a few times, we've had 4 standing ovations in the history of GreenBiz events. Just out and out, everybody stands up and says, "Oh my God, that was amazing." Puck had 2 of those. He's just this ridiculously compelling, self-deprecating but brilliant former Marine who just gets you where you live, but intellectually is just amazing. But what I love about what they're doing is that it goes to something I've been talking about for a long time, which is that we don't have in our world any leaders, political, business, cultural leaders, who can tell a story of what happens if we get things right. Think about it. We have a bunch of people out there talking about what happens if we get things wrong. Thank you, Al Gore. Thank you, Bill McKibben. Thank you, Bill McKibben. Critically important. But we don't have anyone telling this compelling story, this virtuous circle of what happens of how sustainability and addressing climate and water and food and ag and all these things engender economic development and job creation, workforce development and housing, water, food, energy, security, build communities and strengthen communities, create the kind of resilience and that will enable us to withstand not just those kinds of shocks, but political and geopolitical kinds of shocks. We don't have anyone sort of telling those kinds of stories. And as a result, sustainability, as you well know, is relegated often to this crunchy, stereotypical world that somehow is against all of those kinds of interests, our national interests, our economic interests, and even our personal and family interests. And so these guys have that story. They have created this. It's both a top-down story and a bottom-up story, top-down in terms of the framework that needs to happen, but also the story of what's already taking place around America and outside America. And this is an American story, but it certainly is happening outside of that. In terms of these kinds of experiments and these kinds of things that are initiatives and partnerships and community efforts that are already taking place, that if we align this grand strategy with what's already taking place, we have some really exciting things to do. So I'm really excited that the 3 of us are writing a book titled, at least tentatively titled, America's Business Plan, A Grand Strategy for Prosperity, Security, and Sustainability. This isn't really a book plug because it's not written yet and it won't be out for about 15 months, but looking to have it come out in Q1 15 as the election conversation is gearing up. with the audacious goal that maybe this might help inform that. But I find this terribly exciting and for all of us in terms of how this connects with the work that we're all doing and how this builds into rolls up into a much bigger opportunity. And so you put these three things together, this world of sustainable business, which is where I began, and add in this technology piece, which brings in a much bigger audience, both in business, but also cities and innovators and makers and a whole community of people who hadn't necessarily been part of the sustainability conversation. And now the security piece, and well, this is the rest of my career. This is what there's far more work here than I could possibly accomplish in the 10 or whatever, or 15 or, whatever number of years I get to do what I do going forward, if I'm lucky enough to be able to do it that long. And so this is what excites me, and this is where I think there's just a terrific opportunity here. So you put it all together, this quest for figure out what's going on out there and realizing that what's going on out there isn't necessarily moving the needle, and then looking at how these new opportunities around technology and around security, begin to create a much, much bigger opportunity than I certainly knew was possible, and of course had not a clue about back there when I was in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. But it ultimately boils down to this fact that this remains an incredibly exciting time to do what we're doing, to be in the world of sustainability, to be having the conversations that you'll be having the next couple days, and to do the kind of work that you all get to do and that I get to watch and help amplify and convene some of you from time to time. This is a really exciting and scary, because I don't want to be too Pollyannish about this. We don't know whether we can really solve these problems at the scale, speed, and scope that's required. But we're sure as hell going to try, and there's really a huge opportunity out there. So let me just end with one final thought. The most interesting, provocative, stimulating questions in this whole sustainability space all begin with the same 4 words. What would it take? And you can fill in the rest of that with whatever, whether it's about your company, your life, or the planet. I've thrown some up here just, what would it take to bring renewable energy to scale? What would it take for us as a society to prosper within our ecological means and limits? What would it take to create food, energy, water, housing security, to make sustainability a national strategy, a national imperative, to create cities that are resilient in every sense of that term, and ultimately to improve lives and move the needle? You can ask your own question, and it could be as simple as, what would it take for me to be gainfully employed for the next 10 years, or to get that client, or to achieve this next goal? But I'm hoping it's bigger. I'm hoping it's bolder. I'm hoping it's more audacious than that. And so, what's your what would it take question? What's the big opportunity that you see or would like to see in your world, in the world? I hope that as you look at the many terrific topics that you'll be talking about today and tomorrow, and as you go back, literally, what do I do Monday morning, and think about where you want to take this, where you can take this, that you think bigger, because we need to do that. And as I said, there's huge opportunities for doing that. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for thinking about these things. Thank you so much for what you do. And thank you for your valuable time this morning. Appreciate it.
We have a few minutes if people have some questions. I want to ask Joel, we've got a few minutes now.
And we have mics, so just people just stand up and scream it out.
Yeah.
Yeah, just go ahead. You.
So what do you see the challenges for emerging professionals and established professionals in sustainability? Like bringing people who've been doing this together for 20, 25, 30 years, and people who are coming out of many flourishing graduate programs in sustainability.
Yeah. So what are the challenges for people just getting into the field? And I'm sure a lot of you do get these calls regularly, networking or informational interviews or networking things about, how do I get in this field? Or, what do I need to study? Or, whatever. Who do I need to know? And I'm going to do a non sequitur and come back to answer that. I studied journalism at Berkeley, and I was the last year that you could get a BA in journalism. They actually abolished that degree after me, not because of me, I hope, but what they basically said is that if you want to be a journalist, yeah, take writing courses and all that, but go learn something. Go study history, study geology, study business, study French, whatever it is, but go learn something. And, then you can, if you want to get a master's, you can get an MJ and all that kind of thing. But similarly, I think that to some extent that sustainability is too important to be left to sustainability professionals. And I mean that with all due respect and love for all of you. But that one of the challenges is that people go and they study sustainability. But that's not what the world needs. We need engineers, we need designers, we need marketing and communications people. We need people who can tell stories, and we need people who understand biology and geology and a whole range of systems who can bring those skills to a business. So I always say, study sustainability if you want, but go learn something, go learn a topic, and don't necessarily, a lot of them, because of the work that we do, want to go into the sustainability department in a company. And I say, no, go bring your green gene to some part of business, and it may be frustrating for a time that you don't get to exercise it as much, you don't get to wear it on your sleeve, or it isn't the centerpiece of your job. But at minimum, go learn how business works. Go learn some function of business, or as many functions as you can. And so I think that's, I'm not sure that's an answer they want to hear. They want to hear, oh, you do this and join ISSP, and you're in. And, it's not, as you very well know, all of you very well, painfully know, it's not that simple. And so I think that's the challenge, is how do we get people who get sustainability but are not so centered on it that they don't really understand? Because there's a lot of, to be in sustainability you need, I think, and I certainly am one of these, I don't know if it's a pragmatic idealist or an idealist pragmatist or something like that, but you need to combine those two. You need to see what's possible and the big idea here, but you need to really get into the weeds in terms of how a company works and doesn't work, and how change happens. Change being the great enemy of sustainability, at least organizationally, and frankly in our households as well. So I'm not sure that, like I said, is the satisfying answer that people want to hear, that you even want to hear, but it's the real answer, is that you don't get to just, you can. There are some people, and I know some terrific young sustainability professionals who came out of school gung-ho on this, and they actually got jobs in a big company doing something, and they're aggregating data to create a sustainability report, and they may get frustrated by that they're not actually doing God's work. They're kind of doing, advanced or some version of accounting, which is important, but not necessarily what the world-changing work they wanted to do. But most people don't come in it that way. Most sustainability people come through, it's been only recently that people grow up wanting to go into sustainability. Most of us found our way there through some backdoor, side door, crooked, twisted path. And I still think that's not inappropriate, that there needs to be, you need to sort of learn something first before you have the right to really, be at the table this. But there are many, many paths, and mine is certainly non-traditional, and I would be the last person on earth to say that this is the way it must be done. Yeah.
Have you looked at infrastructure in the organizations that you talked about? The reason I'm asking this, I come from the civil engineering side. Just at a conference in Long Beach where we were frustrated over the fact that while your bar chart showing utilities and other elements being the biggest hits in terms of non-sustainable performance, infrastructure is driving that, and the civil engineers are just stuck in this doldrum of having the way they're working is judged on whether or not you did it like everybody else did, or else you're subject to litigation. I mean, that to me is the most troublesome factor in all of this. I'm wondering if you looked at that, is there anything we should be doing in that field to drive it the way you're describing in terms of the positive message you're delivering today?
Well, I mean, this is where the private sector and the public sector another place where they need to find common cause, because infrastructure is the kind I think you're generally talking about is owned by it comes out of public works, cities, counties, states, U.S., the Army Corps of Engineers and all that, rather than maybe and the city of Denver and all that. But there is this, I think, really interesting movement towards green infrastructure. I was here in Denver at CH2M Hill headquarters in September, and looking at what they're doing and how they're thinking about it. And there's a number of conferences around what's called green infrastructure. CH2M Hill just formed a partnership with Conservation International. No, it was the Nature Conservancy, I believe. To really start looking at some of this. And some, companies have done this too. Dow, chemical, or Dow, they're just called now, trying to hide the chemical part of what they do. Well, they do a lot of life science, other kinds of things as well. In a plant in Texas, had an opportunity to create a wastewater treatment plant, a traditional concrete in the ground, kind of thing, or look at another means of how do you mitigate the water issues and also ensure that a steady supply of water that they needed for their plant. And they decided to forego the traditional concrete and steel structure for some stream mitigation and green infrastructure that cost a fraction, I think $2 million versus $20 million, and provided a lot more benefits at almost zero operating cost. And so we're starting to see some of this. It's still early days, and you're right that that the civil engineers, they don't get fired for doing it the way it's always been done. And so this is another area where change management becomes part of this. But it's not just change management. It gets into insurance. Of how do we make sure that those companies that underwrite risk, understand this new world and what's possible. So it's one of many exciting parts of this. I think green infrastructure was on that big long list of things because I'm sort of starting to see more and more about it. But it's going to be hard. It's another huge shift of a big ocean liner that needs to happen, and it's going to take a long time for that to happen. But we're starting to see Denver is doing something interesting things with water. First of all, Denver Water is the only water company in the world that has their own full-time climate scientist. I think that's, and Laura, I forget her name. I had a chance to meet her when I was here in September, and they're actually doing some really interesting things in understanding climate science and how that relates to Denver's water needs and Denver's demographic changes as people are moving back into the city, and what that means for the kind of infrastructure, the water and wastewater infrastructure that's needed to address water for the next 50 or 75 years. So that's going to be an interesting thing. I feel like that we're hovering, that we need to move on, right? Great. Well, thank you again so much.
Visit sustainabilityprofessional.org for more about the conference and other exciting programs from ISSP, the world's leading professional association of sustainability practitioners.